No, thank you, Elisa, for the warm introduction. We are very, very welcome. We are very, very pleasured and honored to have Keith here with us today, who is the Chief Privacy Officer of Google, to share with us a little bit about the future, decoding the future. See the pun there? But yeah, before we get started, we'd love to have Keith to do a bit of a quick introduction of himself, what he do, and it's a little bit of a background, and I guess all the various things that you've been involved in, which all of you might not have known. Go ahead, Keith.
Sure thing. Thank you, Jerel. Can folks hear me okay? Yeah. All right, excellent. Let's see, what would be relevant to what we're doing here today? In 60 seconds or less, sort of how I got to where I am. Went to law school, decided I didn't want to be a lawyer in the traditional sense, so went into startups right out of law school. Did two that failed magnificently. I think one was described in Forbes as the most bloated whale on the .com beach bleeding money until we died. Third one was wildly successful and made somebody else very rich. And then I went into more traditional companies. So I went to IBM and became the security and privacy technology lead for their security, privacy, and wireless practice globally. I then went in a very strange, I think my mic just to limited brands, which some of you, yeah, my mic is going in and out. Is this one better? Can folks hear me okay? Great. Limited Brands, some of you may recognize it. That was the parent company of Victoria's Secret. Back then it was massive. We had about 4,400 stores around the world. Did that for a while. I was their Director of Enterprise Information Policy. I reported to the Chief Marketing Officer, again, all in my effort to run away from being a lawyer. Left there, went to Macy's in Bloomingdale's, which many of you are probably familiar with. I was their first Chief Privacy Officer. When they offered me the job reporting to their General Counsel, I turned it down, saying I didn't think that job could be successful, reporting to the GC in a large retail organization. So they invited me back in, they rolled out an org chart, and everyone under the CEO, they asked me to pick a president and choose who I wanted to report to. So I did that, sort of had a great time at Macy's. Thought that would be the last place I would ever work, thought I would retire there, I really loved my job. My wife at the time was not happy living in the Midwest. We were in Columbus, Ohio, and she wanted to get back to the coast. We were both East Coasters, born and raised, and I had told her the only company that I would leave Macy's for would be Google. And I didn't go to Berkeley, Stanford, Harvard, or Yale, so that wasn't going to happen. Let's get comfortable in the Midwest. True story, about a week later, I got a call from the Deputy General Counsel at Google asking me if I would be interested in coming in and helping them build out a privacy program. I was sure my wife was trolling me. I thank God to this day that I sincerely thought that it was a joke. I didn't think there was any chance that this person would cold call me for this job. And this was back when every Google offer went through this crazy Byzantine process and ultimately had to be signed off on by Larry Page. So that was in October of 2010. I got my offer in March of 2011. And I joined Google. So I've been there ever since. And in my time at Google, I have had various kinds of leadership roles there. I do serve as the company's Chief Privacy Officer. In that role, I lead the worldwide privacy legal team. I also lead our privacy and consumer protection and compliance teams, as well as our global consumer protection legal team. So happy to talk about that. The other things that I do, I do peanut butter myself to sort of borrow, that came up really strangely. But I spread myself quite thin in some respects. I do a lot of different things. I dabble. I am on the CXO advisory board for Charles River Ventures. I am on the CXO advisory board for Menlo. I'm a venture partner with Menlo. I work here with DECODE. I do some nonprofit board work as well. So I really try to do a lot of things. I could not be more interested in the venture space, in entrepreneurship generally, in working with students like yourselves and with entrepreneurs like yourselves, trying to navigate the madness that's going on in the world today. So really excited to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Keith. And your background speaks so much about privacy, right? So why don't we first have a quick overview of what you think is happening in the world of privacy right now, and what are some of the major challenges that people in this space are experiencing?
Sure. How much time do we have?
A quick overview.
Yeah. So really broadly speaking, I think one of the challenges with privacy is it is incredibly personal. It's incredibly contextual. It is subjective. It's based in norms and beliefs and traditions Your socioeconomic background affects the way you think about privacy. Where you were born, the culture you were raised in, your relationships with people affect the way you think about privacy. When I was a kid, if someone talked about privacy, it was all about a woman's right to choose. It was about Roe v. Wade. That was, if you talked to a lawyer about privacy, that's where they were going to go. Then most of my professional career, people talked about this dichotomy, whereas if you were in the US, we tend to think about privacy almost like a property right. You could contract it away if you clicked on an agreement, the privacy policy a certain way. And that drove a lot of the innovation, the way we thought about data. It allowed companies to do a lot of things for the last 20 years that drove a lot of innovation and data-driven growth. On the other side of the Atlantic, in Europe, they had a different view of privacy. It was specifically guaranteed under the European Charter. So it was inalienable. You couldn't contract it away. And that created a whole bunch of friction between legal regimes. And now, incredibly, for anyone who's paying attention, we've sort of swung back. Right now, we're again thinking in a post-Dobbs world about privacy in the context of fundamental human rights here in the US as well, and what it all means and what kind of society we want to live in. So you take that and you juxtapose the velocity and the complexity of technology today, and you think about the amount of digital exhaust we all generate, and increasingly how much of our lives are intermediated by technology, how much of our relationships with each other are intermediated by technology. Privacy and data protection, it's ubiquitous, it's everything. It is literally an aspect of any conversation we have about entrepreneurship, value generation, human rights. Privacy is everywhere, and we're seeing that. In terms of legal careers, privacy is far and away the fastest growing practice area. It was this strange outlier discipline 15, 20 years ago, and now we cannot staff roles in privacy legal, privacy engineering, and all of the associated adjacent disciplines. We just can't find people fast enough because it's growing so quickly.
Thank you for the insight. And it's so funny because like a lot of people, some people might even say like privacy is dead. Like your phones probably know more about you than you know about yourself, right? And like as you use it, just know where you are, what you do, the whole lifestyle basically. So adding on to that, like what are your thoughts on whether, I guess, how things evolve, and also what's the role of entrepreneurship and innovation in this space to try and address this problem of like your phones and apps knowing more about you than you even know yourself?
Sure. So this is super interesting too, right? When we take this notion that privacy is dead, which is, it's a reasonable provocation. We are producing so much data. There is so much information that is being generated, again, through our interaction with technology every day. And things live forever unless they're otherwise deleted, right? I had a colleague at another company years ago that ran this internal campaign that said digital is forever. It's this really interesting idea. You're producing data, and a lot of times people don't think about the life cycle of memory. This is actually a really interesting philosophical debate that's gone on in the background for years now. I sat between the guy who some of you may be familiar with, the engineering background guy, Alessandro Christie from Carnegie Mellon, on the one side of me at dinner. On the other side was a guy named J. Trevor Hughes, who runs the International Association of Privacy Professionals. And Trevor Hughes kicked off this provocation for the conversation saying, isn't it amazing the fact that so much about us is going to be preserved, the fact that we're losing our ability to forget, it's going to force us to become more forgiving and more understanding. That because everyone makes stupid decisions as a teenager and as an undergrad, and historically the document, the memory of the evidence of one bad decision could destroy your career. Now we are moving into an age where we're going to have to find the capacity to forget, because everyone is going to be disqualified from the most exciting opportunities, because everyone will make those mistakes and they're never going to go away. And this sort of very optimistic, positive signal about the way this is changing our culture and our society. Alessandro has said, probably not. And he's like, actually, all of the research that we are doing suggests that the half-life of negative inferences and negative information is far, far longer than the half-life of positive inferences and positive information. Now, I don't know how all that resolves. We at Google, we're doing certain things like, we are really trying to innovate on how to do more with less. We're trying to reduce our data footprint, where we're deleting massive amounts of data automatically in time. We're changing default settings so that your data in many of our key products deletes automatically without you sort of having to make those kinds of selections. That's a massive pivot for companies where historically we wanted to collect as much as we possibly could on the theory that we could solve some hard societal problem or generate some incredible amount of value in the future in ways that we're not anticipating now. the equities have shifted. Now the risks of holding all that data are much better understood than they used to be. We don't want to hold on to data unless we're supremely confident, A, the data subject wants us to, and they expect that, and B, we understand how we're going to deliver value back to users by holding on to it. So it's sort of a big transition there. Now, to your point about the role of entrepreneurship, it's never been more essential that we are empowering and motivating entrepreneurs to be thinking about privacy-enhancing technologies. There could not be more opportunity in this space. We have very hard problems to solve. We could have a much longer conversation about the relationship between the complexity of privacy and data protection as sort of a social, philosophical, moral, normative issue. We're never going to compute that away. We're going to need thoughtful, philosophical, moral people to be devoting themselves in space to make sure that we're weighing the equities correctly. We're thinking about the relationship between freedom of expression, keeping people safe, law enforcement access to data, and a strong individual right to privacy. That's hard work, and computers can't solve that for us. But what data to delete? How do we manage data at an unprecedented scale across these huge systems? How do we manage the migration to Web3 in a way that we can actually build these systems in a way that empowers users, allows them to have more control over their data, realize more of the value of the information that's about themselves? All of that is going to require entrepreneurs, innovators, the best engineers in the world to help us leverage the benefits of technology to solve these problems at scale. Because there are problems and there are risks and there are issues that are at this unprecedented numerical scale. The only way we're going to solve those is through incredible innovation in terms of the technologies that will enable us to manage that risk down.
Got it. And you mentioned a lot about data, right? You mentioned data like, I don't know how many times I was counting the word data there. But curious to know, how do you see the future of data? Like, is it going to be decentralized, centralized? How does Web3 come into the whole place? And I guess if you could kind of sneak in a little bit about like your personal predictions and any thesis that you have around the future of data.
So I always get nervous and skeptical when people set up binaries. Is it going to be this or that? Is it going to be one thing or the other? I would say it's inevitably going to be a hybrid of all of these things. I think we are moving into an increasingly complex and complicated future, and we need to be thoughtful and recognize where do we put our chips in different contexts to deliver the best outcomes for people all over the world. Looking at data, right, I'll use sort of a very real example for me. One of the most rewarding experiences I've had in my Google career was at the front end of COVID-19. I was tagged by Sundar, along with a small group of other people, to kind of pull together a project around exposure notification. So the background of this was we had a lot of policymakers around the world who were hitting us up saying, you have all this data, you know location, you know where people are, you can help us do contact tracing, so do that. Help us figure out who has COVID, where they are, and who they've been near. And much of my life, for a series of months, was meeting with policymakers virtually around the world, explaining to them, A, we don't have the data that we think we have. So for Google and Android, location history is an opt-in feature. It's not on unless you turn it on. If it is turned on, it's not really that fine-grained. Like, we might get you on the wrong side of the street or the wrong floor of a building. You can't do contact tracing that way. It would end up being net negative in terms of the public policy problem we were trying to solve. So I was disappointing a lot of policymakers by saying, we are not really in a position to do the thing they're asking us to do. Now, right around that time, some thinkers at several different places, inside of Google, inside of our good friends at Apple, as well as at MIT and Stanford, there were a lot of interesting things happening. Where folks were like, well, wait a minute, maybe it's not really about location data, maybe it's about proximity. And maybe we could bend the existing use of the Bluetooth protocols to figure out how to use proximity data to solve this problem and actually deliver something useful for public health officials around the world. So this feverish work came together. We had this unprecedented collaboration with our frenemies at Apple to where we both have important pieces to this puzzle. How do we come together and do it? And one of the things that was so interesting was we were firmly committed to the same conclusions that our colleagues on the other side were, that we needed to do this in a privacy protective way. Because if we got it wrong, if we built something on top of location services that allowed governments or others to build massive centralized location databases with a high level of confidence to say who was where, when, and with whom, we could build a surveillance architecture that could be weaponized in ways that we could anticipate, and many ways that we couldn't anticipate, and that was a completely unacceptable state. And smart, thoughtful people around the world were seeing that risk as well, and they were very nervous that that's what was going to happen coming at us. So instead, we committed unwaveringly at the front end of this. We were not going to have centralized massive repositories of location data, and we weren't going to make that information available to governments. That was a contentious conversation. I was on VCs with government officials over and over and over again explaining to them, I understand that you want to do this thing, and with their public health experts saying, we need access to this data. If you don't give us access to this data, people are going to die. Like, I've never felt more pressure in my work to really be thoughtful and considering what we were doing. And over the course of about a month and a half, where nobody was sleeping very much because we felt the enormity of the mission, we realized, we hypothesized, we tested, and we proved the efficacy of the system was not diminished by building it in the most privacy protective way possible. That was the direct result of entrepreneurship and innovation and people not accepting experts, not accepting that there was a community of experts who was saying, you have to build it in this way, or you are going to build it suboptimally. We had people who were thinking outside of the box who were saying, actually, it's going to work even better if we do it in this privacy protective way. We did that. We still ran into all kinds of political problems, which we can talk about in another forum sometime, which is an interesting conversation, like how do you get this deployed globally in a way that you can maximize the benefits of it. But we did build the thing. We did it collaboratively with Apple. We did it in connection with governments all around the world, and we saved lives. And we did it in a way that now, as hopefully the pandemic is moving into the rearview mirror, we are not afraid that we built a surveillance architecture that could be weaponized to hurt marginalized communities or disempowered people, or to build a surveillance state in parts of the world that we don't want to be complacent in.
I mean, it's so meaningful. Like, I mean, you being at the forefront of like impacting lives, saving, I guess, contact tracing, and like doing whatever Google does best at like resolving the whole pandemic situation, right? Also curious to know, like, what's your thoughts on the future of work? Like, I mean, remote working, hybrid, and stuff like that. I also, like, in addition to that, also around the whole leadership styles, right? So I'm sure you have, across your career, worked with many CEOs, Larry, Sundar. How have your leadership styles been different? I mean, that's number one. And number two, what are some of the ways that you think that because of COVID, things have changed so much that current leaders in this room should actually adopt some practices that could be effective for them leading, I guess, whether it's a hybrid team, remote team, or an in-person team. Things have probably changed.
I think you just asked me 3 questions, each of which we can sort of I'll start at the beginning and then sort of try to hammer through it as best I can. So remote work, like I won't spend too much time on this because I think others who are as or more sophisticated than me have been talking about this all day, and there's no solution I think immediately in front of us. I would say, I would just own the fact I was wrong about this one. Like I was a remote work skeptic from the get-go, and I work at a company that was probably more prepared than any other on earth to rotate to remote work. I thought that this was sort of a bit of a kind of an excursion and an experiment that we were going to quickly realize was massively mistaken, and all the companies who over-rotated were going to have a hard time finding their way back. I am a fan of in-office work. The thing I love the most about my job is the people that I get to work with, and the fact that I get to interact with them in real space, and the fact that I get to travel the world and see teams in different places. Like, all of that is so valuable to me and biased me on the opportunities and the benefits of remote work. What I have seen over the course of the last year, obviously everyone's struggling with it, right? I think there is still a lot of confusion and conflicting data from what I can tell in terms of which jobs can be remotely executed at the same level of efficiency and efficacy. What kind of cultures and organizations, how do you think about all that as you think about your long-term strategy? What's the right balance? What's the right level of flexibility? To the extent I were to prognosticate, I actually think we are probably going to be hybrid for a very long time. I think we are going to see growing pressure to get people back in the office for a lot of functions, because my instinct, and this is just instinct, it's not based on any sort of data or inside information, is we're going to find that there are a whole bunch of efficiencies that are lost and long-term costs that are not yet fully realized by having people work remotely. So I think we'll see more pressure to get people back in the office more often than they probably are right now. And then I think there will be teams and functions and companies that will forever be largely hybrid or largely remote. I don't know what that balance is going to look like. I don't think anybody does. I think a lot of people are making their bets right now. so I'm as curious as everybody to see where we all land. You asked a question about changing leadership styles across sort of the CEOs that I've worked with, focusing on Google. It was interesting, right? Like Larry, of course, a founder, leader, very mission-driven. The early Google culture, we used to talk all the time about organizing the world's information, making it universally accessible and useful. It allowed us to do things like Google Books, which I thought was one of the most amazing things. The relationship between Google Books and copyright law at the time was a complicated one that I will not explicitly opine on here right now. But the fact that we had a culture in the company that would take that risk and do it in furtherance of sharing all human knowledge with anyone who had access to a device that allowed them to plug in the internet, that moves me, that I'm passionate about that. That's really exciting. I'm proud to be at a company that moved the needle on that, and a company that brought search to anyone, sort of created an unprecedented availability for information from around the world. The transition to Sundar, was interesting. My experience of Google under Sundar's leadership, very exciting. I feel very strongly, I feel morally aligned with the mission of the company. And it feels a little different. And here I'm not speaking for Google. This isn't sort of an official position. This is my personal experience of the company. But having lived through that sort of transition of leadership, and in my own space for privacy and data protection, Sundar was very explicit about his commitment to recognizing Google's responsibility to bring the benefits of technology to users everywhere in the world, irrespective of their economic condition, irrespective of where they find themselves. That again, that really moves me. I'm really passionate about that. The idea that someone living in an underdeveloped country in a largely agrarian economy that has access to a $30 smartphone with limited data access, our commitment to giving that person all of the benefits of technology that we can deliver across our platforms, that's incredible. That changes the way we engage from the Google of 10 years ago, right? Like, in order to do that, we need to engage multilaterally with governments all around the world. We need to be respectful. We need to be humble. We need to be deferential. Humility and deference did not define the first 10 years of our existence, right? Those are new skills. They're new ways for us to show up. I've had the privilege of living across that transition, and we're not done yet, right? Like, we've got new problems. The world is changing around us. It's increasingly complex and challenging. So I'm curious, 10 years from now, hopefully I'm having the same conversation with you all, and I can say what sort of the next chapter looks like and what I've learned from it.
Sounds good. That's super insightful, and thank you for sharing that. One question I want to make sure that we have time for the audience, because I know, like previous sessions, audience are probably struggling to find questions, but I have my last question for you. Who do you think it's a mentor that you learned from, and I guess why do you feel like they are the best mentors for you?
So I mentioned that I got this call from this woman when I was at Macy's, sitting in Cincinnati, Ohio, who invited me to interview for a job at Google. Her name was Nicole Wong. There's fun serendipity here because Nicole did her graduate degree in journalism here at Berkeley, and I'm sure she was heavily influenced by Esther's work and others. So I have a massive debt of gratitude to Esther and to Berkeley for the impact that they've indirectly had on my own life through Nicole. I didn't get to work with Nicole for very long. She left Google a few months after I joined, which was catastrophic for me in the moment. But in the time that I did work with her, this notion of, we would frequently go to DC, we would frequently meet with senior policymakers on both sides of the aisle. There was an overt, presumptive hostility in those rooms. They were skeptical, they were political, they had a very specific agenda of what they wanted to accomplish in their conversations with us. And I watched her enter into that conversation and ignore that hostility rather than engage with it, rather than accept the necessity of an adversarial conversation. She would laugh lightly. She would humanize the conversation so that people knew they were having a conversation with another human being who was committed to delivering some positive outcome that we weren't necessarily totally clear on what it might be. She kept that range of possibilities open in every discussion. I have modeled that behavior. I have different tools than Nicole did. She had a better sense of humor than I did, probably. She was more socially graceful than I will ever be. But that notion of when I'm in a conversation with people who may not trust me, who may not like me because they don't know me, I hope, and who may have certain presumptions about me, how do I show humility, show deference, show willingness to listen, and cause them to check their assumptions about who I am and check their assumptions about what's possible, such that I can then collaboratively persuade, which is what I'm really ultimately there to do. Most of my job is not manipulation, it's not disinformation. I'm not trying to kind of win people over necessarily by manipulation. It is collaborative persuasion. How can I figure out where our interests are aligned? How can I figure out what they're really after? And then how can I figure out how to line up my interests with theirs so that we can deliver mutual wins? She taught me more than anyone else has in my career on how to set up a conversation with them. That's kind of
That's amazing. And thanks for sharing that. I'm sure all of the audience will probably start Googling your name and you might see a rising Google search for that. All right, so now we'd like to open up to the floor for questions. Anybody just feel free to raise your hand. We have a mic here probably for anyone that wants to ask a question.
Hi Keith, my name is Brian. I have a quick question about like going forward, like privacy and everything. You talked about like how it was 10 years ago, and I'm like, what's your prediction on like 5 years from now? Like, what if like, for example,
like I see myself as living forward, we're gonna be more digital and everything is gonna be more data centric. But what happens if like sensitive information, bank accounts, social security gets leaked? Is there any ways like a normal individual to regain my privacy?
So again, I would love to host an all-day summit responding to the question you just kind of laid out, because it's a complicated one, right? Like what I would say, I'll say two things. First, I will describe the trajectory that I see, and then I'll talk about some reasons for optimism. It is a profoundly complicated environment right now for data protection. The technology is moving faster than it ever has before. We are dealing with larger data sets than we ever have. People are producing more data, companies have access to more information, and the velocity of change is only increasing, right? My assumption is that artificial intelligence and machine learning are going to radically accelerate that experience. I think we are going to do new and amazing and incredible, wonderful things with data that are going to make people's lives better, which is going to drive more rapid adoption, and it's going to continue pushing the envelope. That's going to scare some people, right? It always does. That accelerated change can be destabilizing. It can cause a sort of state of disequilibrium because you think you understand how things are supposed to work. The value being generated by technology is going to be so overwhelming, it will feel like we cannot choose not to engage because it's just going to constitute part of all that. That said, well, one other thing I will say, the rate of legal change, which I referred to before, there are hundreds of data protection laws being passed all over the world right now. They are inconsistent, they are complicated, and they are going to keep lawyers fully employed for the foreseeable future, just figuring out how we navigate this madness. And here is where the technologists need to show up, right? We need to figure out a way. Here's the problem we need to solve, and here's the challenge I will put up there for all of you in this room. When I interviewed Google, actually, one of the questions Nicole asked me was privacy policies, which all of you have probably seen, are massively invested with legalese. They're these long multi-page documents, and they don't really seem to empower people, right? But everyone has to go through them, and they establish supposedly your rights and privileges as to data when you're using a certain product or service. Nobody thinks they work. Like, nobody thinks these things are sufficient. What Nicole asked me was, as we are migrating to a mobile world, and again, this is in 2011, how are we going to give people actual notice? How are we going to get meaningful consent from them to sort of use their data to do stuff? And my solution at the time was basically shrug. Like in an interview question, I was like, yeah, there is no way to solve that problem right now. What we need is better innovation. We need people to think this bit through. And it gets even more complicated when you think about the fact that there's a temptation to swing to the other side and create what looks like sort of the cockpit of the space shuttle with thousands of controls and radio buttons and switches and make the user sort all that stuff out. That's also failing. Right? Users, if we create that kind of cognitive overload and decision fatigue for users, they'll just turn everything on or everything off and it all breaks and we won't realize the real value of technology. We need to solve this problem. How do we hit the perfect balance of in-context decision opportunities for users that are meaningful, that are informed, that make sense? And it's not going to be on a mobile device pretty soon, right? Like there will be other interfaces, whether it's in AR or VR, whether it'll be audible cues, how our relationship with technology is going to evolve. Nobody has all figured out just yet. But one of the key questions we need to carry with us as we innovate is, how do we explain to people what we are doing with data about them, and how do we empower them to make the decisions that matter, and what will the right defaults be? There is pressure right now to default everything off. That's a terrible decision. If you default everything off, so many things break, and people won't have an optimal experience of technology. You can go back to the last 5,000 years of human history, services had defaults on. It's part of the service I'm buying, right? If I'm going to buy a car, I don't want them to have me pick the transmission and pick the braking system and pick sort of like every single thing. I want someone who understands that space better than I do to build a car that's optimized for my needs. We need to begin thinking about technology and sort of software this way as well. How do we create a trusted system, but how do we do it in a way that we actually are empowering users to control their own destinies and to control their own data? I don't have an answer for that yet. We're doing a lot of great work at Google. We're trying to figure it out. I see great work across the board, but there's a ton to be done, and there's billions of dollars to be generated. If somebody solves this riddle, every major data-driven company in the world will migrate to that platform, and they'll figure out some way to use that technology to solve this problem, because this is affecting our ability to move data around the world to generate value, and we need to figure it out. It's an absolute imperative, both from a human rights perspective as well as from an economic sort of value generation perspective.
Knowledge and so much to the gentleman at the corner there.
Hi, same here. Nice to meet you. I'm DPO as well of Allianz Trade in Germany. And I have one general question. How do you deal with the challenges from GDPR, especially the latest decisions in Europe from the regulators not to use Google Analytics in Europe?
Sure. So there's a bunch of questions nested in that question as well. I will say, so it's interesting. The GDPR, for folks that aren't sort of deeply immersed in privacy, is the General Data Protection Regulation. Went into effect in 2018 in Europe. I would love to digress on this because this lets me nerd out on privacy, but I will try to restrain myself. The GDPR was widely perceived as a thing that was going to break all kinds of data-driven businesses around the world, because it was going to impose what were perceived as far more restrictive regulatory requirements on the collection, use, processing, and transfer of data about European citizens specifically, but of course that affects everybody around the world. We spent hundreds of years of human time preparing for the GDPR, so thousands of engineers, hundreds of lawyers, hundreds or thousands of product managers, all figuring out we have these massive services that are being used by billions of people all over the world. How do we continue offering them under this new and changed set of rules? Now, for the GDPR specifically, candidly, as we did that work, there was a lot of stuff we needed to change, but we were probably 75% of the way there when we started. Now, the GDPR is about 300 odd pages of text. We are still living in what I would say is the early enforcement stage of the GDPR, and fully as we would expect, we are one of the largest, most successful multinational tech companies in the world. We are the tip of the spear for enforcers. They tend to come at us first because it's a very efficient way for them to interpret the law that they're applying. So we've got a bunch of cases in the GDPR, some of them resolved, some have not, some we will appeal, some we will not. But our services are going to be used as test cases. Can we operate a certain service in a certain jurisdiction in a certain way? Regulators will target us, we will get a decision, and then every other company in the world will sort of look at the way that law has been interpreted and applied, and they'll hopefully, in the eyes of the regulator, adjust their business accordingly. We're getting it, right? Like I would say for the GDPR, we've got nuances of the law to sort out, and the law will continue to evolve and be amended and everything else. I would love to have a sidebar conversation with any of you about this. We can do a deeper dive on the GDPR. I will say it's getting a whole lot harder, and it's not the GDPR that keeps me awake at night. It is, there are other laws, the DMA, for example, the Digital Markets Act in Europe, which is not a privacy law, it's a competition law, which is trying to address the market power of large platform services. And one of the things that it does, there's a particular section in the DMA that limits any company's ability, or any company that hits certain criteria, to use information collected in the context of one service for the benefit of another service. Now that creates all sorts of interesting problems, right? Like these platforms work the way that they do, and many people appreciate the convenience and the operation if your experience of YouTube is informed by your behavior when you're running Google search, right? If we are no longer able to do that the way that we historically have been able to, that creates challenges for us. So that's a big thing that we're working through right now. The DMA is a major challenge, and it also creates this complexity because now we're no longer only interacting with data protection regulators. So I spent the 5 years preceding the GDPR engaging with one community of regulators around the world, and lawmakers around the world. Now there are multiple communities of regulators, and competition regulators in Europe have different agendas than data protection regulators in Europe. They don't always agree with each other. We could take a position that is negotiated or is consistent with guidance from competition regulators in Europe about the way that our services need to operate, and then we could find that data protection regulators are challenging us, saying that the position that was approved by those competition regulators is inaccurate. So we could end up with this sort of Hobson's choice of which way do we go, where do we choose to realize the risk. That's going to be a very real challenge for us and for any of the companies that's operating at scale. We'll need to sort it out, we will sort it out. We're sort of wrestling with this right now. We're trying to get regulators to talk to each other. We're trying to get lawmakers and policymakers to create improved alignment across these different legal regimes. But when I look at the next 5 years, I see this getting materially more challenging rather than less, because right now we're seeing Europe being the petri dish of this legal evolution. It's moving more quickly. That is having a massive impact on US policymaking. We're looking at potential federal legislation. We're going to white knuckle our way through another state legislative session. Over the course of the next year, we're going to have probably dozens of state laws that are inconsistent in the past year that will be informed by this conversation that's happening in Europe. And then we're seeing our colleagues in Asia that are also looking at this saying, we don't want to be left behind. Like, we want to make sure that we have the most robust protections for the privacy of our citizens as well. So an incredible amount of complexity is brewing around the world in this space. And again, will policymakers, will lawyers, will people like me that are out there trying to drive alignment through this. But the only way we're really going to get there is through an incredible amount of innovation on the technology side to help us build platforms, help us build software that makes doing the right thing easy, that makes doing the right thing something that all of these different companies can buy off the shelf, implement, and then their product managers and their engineers, they don't have to be thinking about how to comply with 27 different laws when they're trying to launch a new feature. It's built into the software, it's coded into the things that we're designing and building and selling. That's what the solution will eventually become.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Keith. And I'm sure everyone in the audience have really learned a lot from your sharing and your insights. All right, I'll hand it over back to Elisa for the next section of the conference.